My Southern Home, or The South and Its People, by William Wells Brown. Preface. No attempt has been made to create heroes or heroines, or to appeal to the imagination or the heart. The earlier incidents were written out from the author's recollections. The later sketches here given are the results of recent visits to the South, where the incidents were jotted down at the time of their occurrence, or as they fell from the lips of the narrators and in their own unadorned dialect. Boston, May 1880. Chapter 1. 10 miles north of the city of St. Louis, in the state of Missouri, 40 years ago, on a pleasant plain sloping off toward a murmuring stream, stood a large frame house, 2 stories high. In front was a beautiful lake, and in the rear an old orchard filled with apple, peach, pear, and plum trees, with boughs untrimmed, all bearing indifferent fruit. The mansion was surrounded with piazzas, covered with grapevines, clematis, and passion flowers. The pride of China mixed its oriental-looking foliage with the majestic magnolia, and the air was redolent with the fragrance of buds peeping out of every nook, and nodding upon you with a most unexpected welcome. The tasteful hand of art which shows itself in the grounds of European and New England villas was not seen there, but the lavish beauty and harmonious disorder of nature was permitted to take its own course, and exhibited a want of taste so commonly witnessed in the sunny South. The killing effects of tobacco plant upon the lands of Poplar Farm was to be seen in the rank growth of the briar, the thistle, the burdock, and the jimpson weed, showing themselves wherever the strong arm of the bondman had not kept them down. Dr. Gaines, the proprietor of Poplar Farm, was a good-humoured, sunny-sided old gentleman who, always feeling happy himself, wanted everybody to enjoy the same blessing. Unfortunately for him, the doctor had been born and brought up in Virginia, raised in a family claiming to be of the F.V.'s, but in reality was comparatively poor. Marrying Mrs. Sarah Scott Pepper, an accomplished widow lady of medium fortune, Dr. Gaines immigrated to Missouri, where he became a leading man in his locality. Deeply imbued with religious feeling of the Calvinistic school, well versed in the Scriptures, and having an abiding faith in the power of the gospel to regenerate the world, the doctor took great pleasure in presenting his views wherever his duties called him. As a physician he did not rank very high, for it was currently reported, and generally believed, that the father, finding his son unfit for mercantile business or the law, determined to make him either a clergyman or a physician. Mr. Gaines, Sr., being somewhat superstitious, resolved not to settle the question too rashly in regard to the son's profession, therefore, it is said, flipped a cent, feeling that heads or tails would be a better omen than his own judgment in the matter. Fortunately for the cause of religion, the head turned up in favour of the medical profession. Nevertheless, the son often said that he believed God had destined him for the sacred calling, and devoted much of his time in exhorting his neighbours to seek repentance. Most planters in our section cared but little about the religious training of their slaves, regarding them as they did their cattle, an investment the return of which was only to be considered in dollars and cents. Not so, however, with Dr. John Gaines, for he took special pride in looking after the spiritual welfare of his slaves, having them all in the great house at family worship night and morning. On Sabbath mornings, reading of the Scriptures and explaining the same generally occupied from 1 to 2 hours, and often till half of the negroes present were fast asleep. The white members of the family did not take as kindly to the religious teaching of the doctor as did the blacks. For his Christian zeal I had the greatest respect, for I always regarded him as a truly pious and conscientious man, willing at all times to give of his means the needful in spreading the gospel. Mrs. Sarah Gaines was a lady of considerable merit, well educated, and of undoubted piety. If she did not join heartily in her husband's religious enthusiasm, It was not for want of deep and genuine Christian feeling, but from the idea that he was of more humble origin than herself, and therefore was not a capable instructor. This difference in birth, this difference in antecedents, does much in the South to disturb family relations wherever it exists, and Mrs. Gaines, when wishing to show her contempt for the doctor's opinions, would allude to her own parentage and birth in comparison to her husband's. Thus, once when they were having a family jar, she, with tears streaming down her cheeks and wringing her hands, said, "My mother told me that I was a fool to marry a man so much beneath me, one so much my inferior in society, and now you show it by hectoring and aggravating me all you can. But never mind, I thank the Lord that he has given me religion and grace to stand it. Never mind, one of these days the Lord will make up his jewels, take me home to glory, out of your sight, and then I'll be devilish glad of it." These scenes of unpleasantness, however, were not of everyday occurrence, and therefore the great house at the Poplar Farm may be considered as having a happy family. Slave children with almost an alabaster complexion, straight hair, and blue eyes, whose mothers were jet black or brown, were often a great source of annoyance in the Southern household, and especially to the mistress of the mansion. Billy, a quadroon of 8 or 9 years, was amongst the young slaves in the doctor's house, then being trained up for a servant. Anyone taking a hasty glance at the lad would never suspect that a drop of Negro blood coursed through his blue veins. A gentleman whose acquaintance Dr. Gaines had made, but who knew nothing of the latter's family relations, called at the house in the doctor's absence. Mrs. Gaines received the stranger and asked him to be seated, and remain till the host's return. While thus waiting, the boy, Billy, had occasion to pass through the room. The stranger, presuming the lad to be a son of the doctor, exclaimed, "How do you do?" and, turning to the lady, said, "How much he looks like his father. I should have known it was the doctor's son if I had met him in Mexico." With flushed countenance and excited voice, Mrs. Gaines informed the gentleman that the little fellow was only a slave and nothing more. After the stranger's departure, Billy was seen pulling up grass in the garden, with bare head, neck, and shoulders, while the rays of the burning sun appeared to melt the child. This process was repeated every few days for the purpose of giving the slave the color that nature had refused it, and yet Mrs. Gaines was not considered a cruel woman. Indeed, she was regarded as a kind, feeling mistress. Billy, however, a few days later, experienced a roasting far more severe than the one he had got in the sun. The morning was cool, and the breakfast table was spread near the fireplace, where a newly built fire was blazing up. Mrs. Gaines, being seated near enough to feel very sensibly the increasing flames, ordered Billy to stand before her. The lad at once complied. His thin clothing giving him but little protection from the fire, the boy soon began to make up faces, and to twist and move about, showing evident signs of suffering. "What are you wriggling about for?" asked the mistress. "It burns me," replied the lad. "Turn around then," said the mistress, and the slave commenced turning around, keeping it up till the lady arose from the table. Billy, however, was not entirely without his crumbs of comfort. It was his duty to bring the hot biscuit from the kitchen to the great house table while the whites were at meal. The boy would often watch his opportunity, take a cake from the plate, and conceal it in his pocket till breakfast was over, and then enjoy his stolen gain. One morning, Mrs. Gaines, observing that the boy kept moving about the room, after bringing in the cakes, and also seeing the little fellow's pocket sticking out rather largely, and presuming that there was something hot there, said, "Come here." The lad came up. She pressed her hand against the hot pocket, which caused the boy to jump back. Again the mistress repeated, "Come here," and with the same result. This, of course, set the whole room, servants and all, in a roar. Again and again the boy was ordered to come up, which he did, each time jumping back, until the heat of the biscuit was exhausted, and then he was made to take it out and throw it into the yard, where the geese seized it and held a carnival over it. Billy was heartily laughed at by his companions in the kitchen and the quarters, and the large blister caused by the hot biscuit created merriment among the slaves rather than sympathy for the lad. Mrs. Gaines being absent from home one day and the rest of the family out of the house, Billy commenced playing with the shotgun, which stood in the corner of the room and which the boy supposed was unloaded. Upon a corner shelf, just above the gun, stood a bandbox, in which was neatly laid away all of Mrs. Gaines' caps and cuffs, which, in those days, were in great use. The gun having the flint lock, the boy amused himself with bringing down the hammer and striking fire. By this action powder was jarred into the pan, and the gun, which was heavily charged with shot, was discharged, the contents passing through bandbox of caps, cutting them literally to pieces and scattering them over the floor. Billy gathered up the fragments, put them in the box and placed it upon the shelf, he alone aware of the accident. A few days later, and Mrs. Gaines was expecting company. She called to Hannah to get her a clean cap. The servant, in attempting to take down box, exclaimed, "Law, missus, if the rats ain't been at these caps and cut 'em all to pieces. Just look here." With a degree of amazement not easily described, the mistress beheld the fragments as they were emptied out upon the floor. Just then a new idea struck Hannah, and she said, "I lay anything dat gun has been shooting off." "Where is Billy? Where is Billy?" exclaimed the mistress. "Where's Billy?" echoed Hannah. Fearing that the lady would go into convulsions, I hastened out to look for the boy, but he was nowhere to be found. I returned only to find her weeping and wringing her hands, exclaiming, "Oh, I am ruined, I am ruined. The company's coming, and not a clean cap about the house. Oh, what shall I do? What shall I do?" I tried to comfort her by suggesting that the servants might get one ready in time. Billy soon made his appearance, and looked on with wonderment, and when asked how he came to shoot off the gun, declared that he knew nothing about it, and if the gun went off, it was of its own accord. However, the boy admitted the snapping of the lock or trigger. A light whipping was all he got, and for which he was well repaid by having an opportunity of telling how the caps flew about the room when the gun went off. Relating the event some time after in the quarters, he said, "Ah, golly, you had oughta seen them caps fly, and the dust and smoke in the room. I thought a judgment day had come, sure enough." On the arrival of the company, Mrs. Gaines made a very presentable appearance, although the caps and laces had been destroyed. One of the visitors on this occasion was a young Mr. Sarpy of St. Louis, who, although above 21 years of age, had never seen anything of country life, and therefore was very anxious to remain overnight and go on a coon hunt. Dr. Gaines, being lame, could not accompany the gentleman, but sent Ike, Cato, and Sam, 3 of the most expert coon hunters on the farm. Night came, and off went the young man and the boys on the coon hunt. The dogs scented game, after being about half an hour in the woods, to the great delight of Mr. Sarpy, who was armed with a double-barrel pistol, which, he said, he carried both to protect himself and to shoot the coon. The halting of the boys and the quick, sharp bark of the dogs announced that the game was treed, and the gentleman from the city pressed forward with fond expectation of seeing the coon and using his pistol. However, the boys soon raised the cry of "Polecat! Polecat! Get out the way!" and at the same time retreating as if they were afraid of an attack from the animal. Not so with Mr. Sarpy. He stood his ground, with pistol in hand, waiting to get a sight of the game. He was not long in suspense, for the white and black spotted creature soon made its appearance, at which the city gentleman opened fire upon the skunk, which attack was immediately answered by the animal, and in a manner that caused the young man to wish that he too had retreated with the boys. Such an odour he had never before inhaled, and what was worse, his face, head, hands, and clothing was covered with the cause of the smell, and the gentleman at once said, "Come, let's go home, I've got enough of coon hunting." But didn't the boys enjoy the fun! The return of the party home was the signal for a hearty laugh, and all at the expense of the city gentleman. So great and disagreeable was the smell that the young man had to go to the barn, where his clothing was removed, and he submitted to the process of washing by the servants. Soap, scrubbing brushes, towels, indeed everything was brought into requisition, but all to no purpose. The skunk smell was there, and was likely to remain. Both family and visitors were at the breakfast table the next morning, except Mr. Sarpy. He was still in the barn, where he had slept the previous night. Nor did there seem to be any hope that he would be able to visit the house, for the smell was intolerable. The substitution of a suit of the doctor's clothes for his own failed to remedy the odour. Dinky the conjurer was called in. He looked the young man over, shook his head in a knowing manner, and said it was a big job. Mr. Sarpy took out a Mexican silver dollar, handed it to the old negro, and told him to do his best. Dinky smiled, and he thought that he could remove the smell. His remedy was to dig a pit in the ground large enough to hold the man, put him in it, and cover him over with fresh earth. Consequently, Mr. Sarpy was, after removing his entire clothing, buried, all except his head, while his clothing was served in the same manner. A servant held an umbrella over the unhappy man, and fanned him during the 8 hours that he was there. Taken out of the pit at 6 o'clock in the evening, all joined with Dinky in the belief that Mr. Sarpy smelt sweeter than when interred in the morning. Still the smell of the polecat was there. 5 hours longer in the pit the following day, with a rub-down by Dinky with his goopher, fitted the young man for a return home to the city. I never heard that Mr. Sarpy ever again joined in a coon hunt. No description of mine, however, can give anything like a correct idea of the great merriment of the entire slave population on Poplar Farm caused by the coon hunt. Even Uncle Ned, the old superannuated slave who seldom went beyond the confines of his own cabin, hobbled out on this occasion to take a look at the gentleman from the city, while buried in the pit. At night, in the quarters, the slaves had a merry time over the coon hunt. "Ah, golly, but didn't the polecat give him a big dose?" said Ike. "But how Mr. Sarpy did talk French to hisself when the old coon peppered him," remarked Cato. "He won't go coon hunting again soon, I bet you," said Sam. The coon hunt and the gemmen from the city was the talk for many days. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2. I have already said that Dr. Gaines was a man of deep religious feeling, and this interest was not confined to the whites, for he felt that it was the Christian duty to help to save all mankind, white and black. He would often say, "I regard our Negroes as given to us by an all-wise Providence, for their especial benefit, and we should impart to them Christian civilization." And to this end he labored most faithfully. No matter how driving the work on the plantation, whether seed time or harvest, whether threatened with rain or frost, nothing could prevent his having the slaves all in at family prayers, night and morning. Moreover, the older servants were often invited to take part in the exercises. They always led the singing, and on Sabbath mornings were permitted to ask questions eliciting scriptural explanations. Of course, some of the questions and some of the prayers were rather crude, and the effect, to an educated person, was rather to call forth laughter than solemnity. Leaving home one morning for a visit to the city, the doctor ordered Jim, an old servant, to do some mowing in the rye field. On his return, Finding the rye field as he had left it in the morning, he called Jim up and severely flogged him without giving the man an opportunity of telling why the work had been neglected. On relating the circumstance at the supper table, the wife said, "I am very sorry that you whipped Jim, for I took him to do some work in the garden amongst my flower beds." To this the doctor replied, "Never mind, I'll make it all right with Jim." And sure enough he did, for that night at prayers he said, "I am sorry, Jim, that I corrected you today, as your mistress tells me that she set you to work in the flower garden. Now, Jim," continued he, in a most feeling manner, "I always want to do justice to my servants, and you know that I never abuse any of you intentionally, and now tonight I will let you lead in prayer." Jim thankfully acknowledged the apology, and with grateful tears and an overflowing heart accepted the situation, for Jim aspired to be a preacher, like most colored men, and highly appreciated an opportunity to show his persuasive powers, and that night the old man made splendid use of the liberty granted to him. After praying for everything generally, and telling the Lord what a great sinner he himself was, he said, "Now, Lord, I would specially ask you to try to save Marster. You knows that Marster thinks he's mighty good. You knows that Marster says he's going to heaven. But, Lord, I have my doubts, and yet I want Marster saved. Please to convert him over again. Take him, dear Lord, by the nape of the neck, and shake him over hell, and show him his condition. But, Lord, don't let him fall into hell. Just let him see where he ought to go to, but don't let him go there. And now, Lord, if you just save Marster, I will give you the glory." The indignation expressed by the doctor at the close of Jim's prayer told the old negro that for once he had overstepped the mark. "What do you mean, Jim, by insulting me in that manner, asking the Lord to convert me over again, and praying that I might be shaken over hell? I have a great mind to tie you up and give you a good correcting. If you ever make another such a prayer, I'll whip you well, that I will." Dr. Gaines felt so intensely the duty of masters to their slaves that he, with some of his neighbors, inaugurated a religious movement, whereby the blacks at the corners could have preaching once a fortnight, and that, too, by an educated white man. Rev. John Mason, the man selected for this work, was a heavy-set, fleshy, lazy man who, when entering a house, sought the nearest chair, taking possession of it, and holding it to the last. He had been employed many years as a colporteur, or missionary, sometimes preaching to the poor whites, and at other times to the slaves, for which service he was compensated either by planters or by the dominant religious denomination in the section where he labored. Mr. Mason had carefully studied the character of the people to whom he was called to preach, and took every opportunity to shirk his duties and to throw them upon some of the slaves, a large number of whom were always ready and willing to exhort when called upon. We shall never forget his first sermon, and the profound sensation that it created both amongst masters and slaves, and especially the latter. After taking for his text, "He that knoweth his master's will, and doeth it not, shall be beaten with many stripes," he spoke substantially as follows: "Now, when correction is given you, you either deserve it or you do not deserve it. But whether you really deserve it or not, it is your duty, and Almighty God requires that you bear it patiently. You may perhaps think that this is hard doctrine, but if you consider it right, you must needs think otherwise of it. Suppose, then, that you deserve correction, you cannot but say that it is just and right you should meet with it. Suppose you do not, or at least you do not deserve so much or so severe a correction for the fault you have committed, you, perhaps, have escaped a great many more, and are at last paid for all. Or suppose you are quite innocent of what is laid to your charge, and suffer wrongfully in that particular thing, is it not possible you may have done some other bad thing which was never discovered, and that Almighty God, who saw you doing it, would not let you escape without punishment one time or another? And ought you not, in such a case, to give glory to him, and be thankful that he would rather punish you in this life for your wickedness, than destroy your souls for it in the next life? But suppose that even this was not the case, a case hardly to be imagined, and that you have by no means, known or unknown, deserved the correction you suffered. There is this great comfort in it, that if you bear it patiently and leave your cause in the hands of God, he will reward you for it in heaven, and the punishment you suffer unjustly here shall turn to your exceeding great glory hereafter. At this point the preacher hesitated a moment, and then continued. I am now going to give you a description of hell, that awful place that you will surely go to if you don't be good and faithful servants. Hell is a great pit, more than 200 feet deep, and is walled up with stone, having a strong iron grating at the top. The fire is built of pitch pine knots, tar barrels, lard kegs, and butter firkins. One of the devil's imps appears twice a day, and throws about half a bushel of brimstone on the fire, which is never allowed to cease burning. As sinners die, they are pitched headlong into the pit, and are at once taken up upon the pitchforks by the devil's imps, who stand with glaring eyes and smiling countenances, ready to do their master's work. Here the speaker was disturbed by the amens, bless God, I'll keep out of hell, that's my sentiments, which plainly told him that he had struck the right key. Now, continued the preacher, I will tell you where heaven is, and how you are to obtain a place there. Heaven is above the skies. Its streets are paved with gold. Seraphs and angels will furnish you with music which never ceases. You will all be permitted to join in the singing, and you will be fed on manna and honey, and you will drink from fountains and will ride in golden chariots. I am bound for heaven, ejaculated one. Yes, blessed God, heaven will be my happy home, said another. These outbursts of feeling were followed, while the man of God stood with folded arms, enjoying the sensation that his eloquence had created. After pausing a moment or two, the reverend man continued. Are there any of you here who would rather burn in hell than rest in heaven? Remember that once in hell you can never get out. If you attempt to escape, little devils are stationed at the top of the pit, who will, with their pitchforks, toss you back into the pit, kerchunk, where you must remain forever. But once in heaven, you will be free the balance of your days. Here the wildest enthusiasm showed itself, amidst which the preacher took his seat. A rather humorous incident now occurred which created no little merriment among the blacks, and to the somewhat discomfiture of Dr. Gaines, who occupied a seat with the whites who were present. Looking about the room, being unacquainted with the negroes, and presuming that all or nearly so were experimentally interested in religion, Mr. Mason called on Ike to close with prayer. The very announcement of Ike's name in such a connection called forth a broad grin from the larger portion of the audience. Now it so happened that Ike not only made no profession of religion, but was in reality the farthest off from the church of any of the servants at Poplar Farm. Yet Ike was equal to the occasion, and at once responded, to the great amazement of his fellow slaves. Ike had been from early boyhood an attendant upon whites, and he had learned to speak correctly for an uneducated person. He was pretty well versed in Scripture, and had learned the principal prayer that his master was accustomed to make, and would often get his fellow servants together at the barn on a rainy day and give them the prayer, with such additions and improvements as the occasion might suggest. Therefore, when called upon by Mr. Mason, Ike at once said, "Let us pray." After floundering about for a while, as if feeling his way, the new beginner struck out on the well-committed prayer, and soon elicited a loud "Amen" and "Bless God for that" from Mr. Mason, and to the great amusement of the blacks. In his eagerness, however, to make a grand impression, Ike attempted to weave into his prayer some poetry on Cock Robin, which he had learned, and which nearly spoiled his maiden prayer. After the close of the meeting, the doctor invited the preacher to remain overnight, and accepting the invitation, we in the great house had an opportunity of learning more of the reverend man's religious views. When comfortably seated in the parlor, the doctor said, "I was well pleased with your discourse. I think the tendency will be good upon the servants." "Yes," responded the minister, "the Negro is eminently a religious being, more so, I think, than the white race. He is emotional, loves music, is wonderfully gifted with gab, the organ of alimentiveness largely developed, and is fond of approbation. I therefore try always to satisfy their vanity, call upon them to speak, sing, and pray, and sometimes to preach. That suits for this world. Then I give them a heaven with music in it, and with something to eat. Heaven without singing and food would be no place for the Negro. In the cities, where many of them are free and have control of their own time, they are always late to church meetings, lectures, or almost anything else. But let there be a festival or supper announced, and they are all there on time." "But did you know," said Dr. Gaines, "that the prayer that Ike made today he learned from me?" "Indeed?" responded the minister. "Yes. That boy has the imitative power of his race in a larger degree than most Negroes that I have seen. He remembers nearly everything that he hears, is full of wit, and has most excellent judgment. However, his dovetailing the Cock Robin poetry into my prayer was too much, and I had to laugh at his adroitness." The doctor was much pleased with the minister, but Mrs. Gaines was not. She had great contempt for professional men who sprung from the lower class, and she regarded Mr. Mason as one to be endured but not encouraged. The Reverend Henry Pynchon was her highest idea of a clergyman. This gentleman was then expected in the neighborhood, and she made special reference to the fact, to her husband, when speaking of the Negro missionary, as she was wont to call the newcomer. The preparation made, a few days later, for the reception of Mrs. Gaines's favorite spiritual adviser, showed plainly that a religious feast was near at hand, and in which the lady was to play a conspicuous part, and whether her husband was prepared to enter into the enjoyment or not, he would have to tolerate considerable noise and bustle for a week. "Go, Hannah," said Mrs. Gaines, "and tell Dolly to kill a couple of fat pullets, and to put the biscuit to rise. I expect Brother Pynchon here this afternoon, and I want everything in order. Hannah, Hannah, tell Melinda to come here. We mistresses do have a hard time in this world. I don't see why the Lord should have imposed such heavy duties on us poor mortals. Well, it can't last always. I long to leave this wicked world and go home to glory." At the hurried appearance of the waiting maid, the mistress said, "I am to have company this afternoon, Melinda. I expect Brother Pynchon here, and I want everything in order. Go and get one of my new caps, with the lace border, and get out my scallop-bottomed dimity petticoat, and when you go out, tell Hannah to clean the white-handled knives, and see that not a speck is on them, for I want everything as it should be while Brother Pynchon is here." Mr. Pynchon was possessed with a large share of the superstition that prevails throughout the South, not only with the ignorant Negro, who brought it with him from his native land, but also by a great number of well-educated and influential whites. On the first afternoon of the reverend gentleman's visit, I listened with great interest to the following conversation between Mrs. Gaines and her ministerial friend. "Now, Brother Pension, do give me some of your experience since you were last here. It always does my soul good to hear religious experience. It draws me nearer and nearer to the Lord's side. I do love to hear good news from God's people." "Well, Sister Gaines," said the preacher, "I've had great opportunities in my time to study the heart of man. I've attended a great many camp meetings, revival meetings, protracted meetings, and deathbed scenes, and I am satisfied, Sister Gaines, that the heart of man is full of sin, and desperately wicked. This is a wicked world, Sister Gaines, a wicked world." "Were you ever in Arkansas, Brother Pension?" inquired Mrs. Gaines. "I've been told that the people out there are very ungodly." Mr. P. "Oh yes, Sister Gaines. I once spent a year at Little Rock, and preached in all the towns round about there, and I found some hard cases out there, I can tell you. I was once spending a week in a district where there were a great many horse thieves, and one night somebody stole my pony. Well, I knowed it was no use to make a fuss, so I told Brother Tarbox to say nothing about it, and I'd get my horse by preaching God's everlasting gospel, for I had faith in the truth, and knowed that my Savior would not let me lose my pony. So the next Sunday I preached on horse stealing, and told the brethren to come up in the evening with their hearts filled with the grace of God. So that night the house was crammed brim full with anxious souls panting for the bread of life. Brother Bingham opened with prayer, and Brother Tarbox followed, and I saw right off that we were going to have a blessed time. After I got 'em pretty well warmed up, I jumped onto one of the seats, stretched out my hands, and said, 'I know who stole my pony. I've found out. And you are in here trying to make people believe that you've got religion. But you ain't got it. And if you don't take my horse back to Brother Tarbox's pasture this very night, I'll tell your name right out in meeting tomorrow night. Take my pony back, you vile and wretched sinner, and come up here and give your heart to God.' So the next morning I went out to Brother Tarbox's pasture, and sure enough there was my bobtail pony. Yes, Sister Gaines, there he was, safe and sound. Ha ha ha." Mrs. G. "Oh, how interesting, and how fortunate for you to get your pony, and what power there is in the gospel. God's children are very lucky. Oh, it is so sweet to sit here and listen to such good news from God's people." Aside. "You, Hannah, what are you standing there listening for, and neglecting your work? Never mind, my lady, I'll whip you well when I'm done here. Go at your work this moment, you lazy hussy. Never mind, I'll whip you well. Come, do go on, Brother Pension, with your godly conversation. It is so sweet. It draws me nearer and nearer to the Lord's side." Mr. P. "Well, Sister Gaines, I've had some mighty queer dreams in my time, that I have. You see, one night I dreamed that I was dead and in heaven, and such a place I never saw before. As soon as I entered the gates of the celestial empire, I saw many old and familiar faces that I had seen before. The first person that I saw was good old Elder Pike, the preacher, that first called my attention to religion. The next person I saw was Deacon Billings, my first wife's father, and then I saw a host of godly faces. Why, Sister Gaines, you knowed Elder Gooseby, didn't you?" Mrs. G. "Why, yes. Did you see him there? He married me to my first husband." Mr. P. "Oh, yes, Sister Gaines, I saw the old elder, and he looked for all the world as if he had just come out of a revival meeting." Mrs. G. "Did you see my first husband there, Brother Pension?" Mr. P. "No, Sister Gaines, I didn't see Brother Pepper there, but I've no doubt but that Brother Pepper was there." Mrs. G. Well, I don't know. I have my doubts. He was not the happiest man in the world. He was always borrowing trouble about something or another. Still, I saw some happy moments with Mr. Pepper. I was happy when I made his acquaintance, happy during our courtship, happy a while after our marriage, and happy when he died. Hannah. Massa Pension, did you see my old man Ben up there in heaven? Mr. P. No, Hannah, I didn't go amongst the niggers. Mrs. G. No, of course Brother Pension didn't go among the blacks. What are you asking questions for? Aside. Never mind, my lady. I'll whip you well when I'm done here. I'll skin you from head to foot. Do go on with your heavenly conversation, Brother Pension. It does my very soul good. This is indeed a precious moment for me. I do love to hear of Christ and Him crucified. Mr. P. Well, Sister Gaines, I promised Sister Daniels that I'd come over and see her a few moments this evening and have a little season of prayer with her, and I suppose I must go. Mrs. G. If you must go, then I'll have to let you. But before you do, I wish to get your advice upon a little matter that concerns Hannah. Last week, Hannah stole a goose, killed it, cooked it, and she and her man Sam had a fine time eating the goose, and her master and I would never have known anything about it if it had not been for Cato, a faithful servant, who told his master all about it, and then, you see, Hannah had to be severely whipped before she'd confess that she stole the goose. Next Sabbath is Sacrament Day, and I want to know if you think that Hannah is fit to go to the Lord's Supper after stealing the goose. Well, Sister Gaines, responded the minister, that depends on circumstances. If Hannah has confessed that she stole the goose, and has been sufficiently whipped, and has begged her master's pardon, and begged your pardon, and thinks she will not do the like again, why then I suppose she can go to the Lord's Supper. For while the lamp holds out to burn, the vilest sinner may return. But she must be sure that she has repented and won't steal any more. Do you hear that, Hannah? Said the mistress. For my part, continued she, I don't think she's fit to go to the Lord's Supper, for she had no cause to steal the goose. We give our servants plenty of good food. They have a full run to the meal tub, meat once a fortnight, and all the sour milk on the place, and I am sure that's enough for anyone. I do think that our Negroes are the most ungrateful creatures in the world. They aggravate my life out of me. During this talk on the part of the mistress, the servant stood listening with careful attention, and at its close Hannah said, I know, missus, that I stole a goose and massa whipped me for it, and I confess it, and I is sorry for it. But, missus, I is going to the Lord's Supper next Sunday, 'cause I ain't a-going to turn my back on my blessed Lord and massa for no old tough goose. Dat I ain't. And here the servant wept as if she would break her heart. Mr. Pension, who seemed moved by Hannah's words, gave a sympathizing look at the negress, and said, Well, Sister Gaines, I suppose I must go over and see Sister Daniels. She'll be waiting for me. After seeing the divine out, Mrs. Gaines said, Now, Hannah, Brother Pension is gone. Do you get the cowhide and follow me to the cellar, and I'll whip you well for aggravating me as you have today. It seems as if I can never sit down to take a little comfort with the Lord without you crossing me. The devil always puts it into your head to disturb me just when I am trying to serve the Lord. I have no doubt but that I'll miss going to heaven on your account. But I'll whip you well before I leave this world. That I will. Get the cowhide and follow me to the cellar. In a few minutes the lady returned to the parlor, followed by the servant whom she had been correcting, and she was in a high state of perspiration, and, on taking a seat, said, Get the fan, Hannah, and fan me. You ought to be ashamed of yourself to put me into such a passion, and cause me to heat myself up in this way, whipping you. You know that it is a great deal harder for me than it is for you. I have to exert myself, and it puts me all in a fever, while you have only to stand and take it." On the following Sabbath, it being communion, Mr. Pynchon officiated. The church being at the Corners, a mile or so from Poplar Farm, the communion wine, which was kept at the doctor's, was sent over by the boy, Billy. It happened to be in the month of April, when the maple trees had been tapped and the sap freely running. Billy, while passing through the sugar camp, or sap bush, stopped to take a drink of the sap, which looked inviting in the newly made troughs. All at once it occurred to the lad that he could take a drink of the wine, and fill it up with sap. So, acting upon this thought, the youngster put the decanter to his mouth and drank freely, lowering the beverage considerably in the bottle. But filling the bottle with the sap was much more easily contemplated than done, for at every attempt the water would fall over the sides, none going in. However, the boy, with the fertile imagination of his race, soon conceived the idea of sucking his mouth full of the sap and then squirting it into the bottle. This plan succeeded admirably, and the slave boy sat in the church gallery that day and wondered if the communicants would have partaken so freely of the wine if they had known that his mouth had been the funnel through which a portion of it had passed. Slavery has had the effect of brightening the mental powers of the Negro to a certain extent, especially those brought into close contact with the whites. It is also a fact that these blacks felt that when they could get the advantage of their owners, they had a perfect right to do so, and the boy Billy, no doubt, entertained a consciousness that he had done a very cunning thing in thus drinking the wine entrusted to his care. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. Dr. Gaines's practice being confined to the planters and their Negroes in the neighborhood of Poplar Farm caused his income to be very limited from that source, and consequently he looked more to the products of his plantation for support. True, the new store at the Corners, together with McWilliams' tannery and Simpson's distillery, promised an increase of population, and therefore more work for the physician. This was demonstrated very clearly by the doctor's coming in one morning somewhat elated, and exclaiming, "Well, my dear, my practice is steadily increasing. I forgot to tell you that neighbor Wyman engaged me yesterday as his family physician, and I hope that the fever and ague which is now taking hold of the people will give me more patience. I see by the New Orleans paper that the yellow fever is raging there to a fearful extent. Men of my profession are reaping a harvest in that section this year. I would that we could have a touch of the yellow fever here, for I think I could invent a medicine that would cure it. But the yellow fever is a luxury that we medical men in this climate can't expect to enjoy. Yet we may hope for the cholera." "Yes," replied Mrs. Gaines, "I would be glad to see it more sickly, so that your business might prosper. But we are always unfortunate. Everybody here seems to be in good health, and I am afraid they'll keep so. However, we must hope for the best. We must trust in the Lord. Providence may possibly send some disease amongst us for our benefit." On going to the office, the doctor found the faithful servant hard at work, and saluting him in his usual kind and indulgent manner, asked, "Well, Cato, have you made the batch of ointment that I ordered?" Cato: "Yes, Massa, I done made de ointment, and now I is making the bread pills. De tater pills is up on the top shelf." Dr. G.: "I am going out to see some patients. If any gentlemen call, tell them I shall be in this afternoon. If any servants come, you attend to them. I expect 2 of Mr. Campbell's boys over. You see to them. Feel their pulse, look at their tongues, bleed them, and give them each a dose of calomel. Tell them to drink no cold water, and to take nothing but water gruel." Cato: "Yes, Massa, I'll tend to 'em." The Negro now said, "I allers knowed I was a doctor, and now the old boss has put me at it. I must change my coat. If any niggers come in, I wants to look suspectable. This jacket don't suit a doctor. I'll change it. Cato's vanity seemed at this point to be at its height, and having changed his coat, he walked up and down before the mirror and viewed himself to his heart's content, and saying to himself, "Ah, now I looks like a doctor. Now I can bleed, pull teeth, or cut off a leg. Oh, well, well, if I ain't put the pill stuff and the ointment stuff together. By golly, that old cuss will be mad when he find out, won't he? Never mind, I'll make it up in pills. And when the flour's on 'em, he won't know what's in 'em. And I'll make some new ointment. Ah, yonder comes Mr. Campbell's Pete and Ned. Them's the ones Massa said was coming. I'll see if I looks right." Goes to the looking glass and views himself. "I am some pumpkins, ain't I?" Knock at the door. "Come in." Enter Pete and Ned. Pete: "Where's the doctor?" Cato: "Here I is. Don't you see me?" Pete: "But where's old boss?" Cato: "That's none of your business. I done told you that I was a doctor. Ain't that enough?" Ned: "Do tell us where the doctor is. I was almost dead. Oh, me. Oh, dear me. I was so sick." Horrible faces. Pete: "Yes, do tell us. We don't want to stand here fooling." Cato: "I tells you again that I's a doctor. I learned a trade under massa." Ned: "Ah, well, then, give me something to stop this pain. Oh, dear me, I shall die." Cato: "Let me feel your pulse. Now put out your tongue. You was very sick. If you don't mind, you'll die. Come out in the shed, and I'll bleed you." Taking them out and bleeding them. "There now, take these pills, 2 in the morning and 2 at night, and if you don't feel better, double the dose. Now, Mr. Pete, what's the matter with you?" Pete: "I's got the cold chills and has a fever in the night." "Come out in the shed, and I'll bleed you," said Cato, at the same time viewing himself in the mirror as he passed out. After taking a quart of blood, which caused the patient to faint, they returned, the black doctor saying, "Now take these pills, 2 in the morning and 2 at night, and if they don't help you, double the dose. I like to forget to feel your pulse and look at your tongue. Put out your tongue." Feels his pulse. "Yes, I tells by the feel of your pulse that I's give you the right pills." Just then, Mr. Parker's Negro boy, Bill, with his hand up to his mouth, and evidently in great pain, entered the office without giving the usual knock at the door, and which gave great offense to the new physician. "What you come in that door without knocking for?" exclaimed Cato. Bill: "My tooth aches so I didn't think to knock. Oh, my tooth! My tooth! Where's the doctor?" Cato: "Here I is. Don't you see me?" Bill: "What, you the doctor? You brack cuss. You looks like a doctor. Oh, my tooth! My tooth! Where's the doctor?" Cato: "I tells you I's a doctor. If you don't believe me, ask these men. I can pull your tooth in a minute." Bill: "Well, then, pull it out. Oh, my tooth! How it aches! Oh, my tooth!" Cato gets the rusty turnkeys. Cato: "Now lay down on your back." Bill: "What for?" Cato: "That's the way massa does." Bill: "Oh, my tooth! Well, then, come on." Lies down. Cato gets a straddle of Bill's breast, puts the turnkeys on the wrong tooth, and pulls. Bill kicks and cries out. "Oh, do stop. Oh, oh, oh!" Cato pulls the wrong tooth. Bill jumps up. Cato. "There now, I told you I could pull your tooth for you." Bill. "Oh, dear me, oh, it aches yet. Oh, me, lordy, massa, you done pulled the wrong tooth. Drat your skin if I don't pay you for this, you brat cuss." They fight and turn over a table, chairs, and bench. Pete and Ned look on. During the melee, Dr. Gaines entered the office and unceremoniously went at them with his cane, giving both a sound drubbing before any explanation could be offered. As soon as he could get an opportunity, Cato said, "Oh, massa, he's to blame, sir, he's to blame. He struck me first." Bill. "Nah, sir, he's to blame. He pulled a wrong tooth. Oh, my tooth, oh, my tooth." Dr. G. "Let me see your tooth. Open your mouth." "As I live, you've taken out the wrong tooth. I am amazed. I'll whip you for this. I'll whip you well." "You're a pretty doctor. Now lie down, Bill, and let him take out the right tooth. And if he makes a mistake this time, I'll cowhide him well. Lie down, Bill." Bill lies down, and Cato pulls the tooth. "There now. Why didn't you do that in the first place?" Cato. "He wouldn't hold still, sir." Bill. "I did hold still." Dr. G. "Now go home, boys, go home." "You've made a pretty muss of it in my absence," said the doctor. "Look at the table." "Never mind, Cato. I'll whip you well for this conduct of yours today. Go to work now and clear up the office." As the office door closed behind the master, the irritated negro, once more left to himself, exclaimed, "Confound that nigger! I wish he was in Jenny. He bite my finger and scratch my face. But didn't I give it to him? Well then, I reckon I did." He goes to the mirror and discovers that his coat is torn. Weeps. "Oh, dear me. Oh, my coat is tore. That nigger has tore my coat." He gets angry and rushes about the room, frantic. "Cuss dat nigger. If I could lay my hands on him, I'd tear him all to pieces. Dat I would. And the old boss hit me with his cane after that nigger tore my coat. By golly, I wants to fight somebody. If old massa should come in now, I'd fight him." Rolls up his sleeves. "Let 'em come now if they dare. Old massa or anybody else. I'm ready for 'em." Just then the doctor returned and asked, "What's all this noise here?" Cato. "Nuffin, sir. Only just I is putting things to rights, as you told me. I didn't hear any noise, except the rats." Dr. G. "Make haste and come in. I want you to go to town." Once more left alone, the witty black said, "By golly, the old boss liked to cotch me that time, didn't he? But wasn't I mad? When I's mad, nobody can do nuffin with me. But here's my coat, tore to pieces. Cuss that nigger." Weeps. "Oh, my coat. Oh, my coat. I'd rudder he had broke my head than to tore my coat. Drat dat nigger, if he ever comes here again, I'll pull out every tooth he got in his head, that I will." End of chapter 3. Chapter 4. During the palmy days of the South, 40 years ago, if there was one class more thoroughly despised than another by the high-born, well-educated Southerner, it was the slave trader, who made his money by dealing in human cattle. A large number of the slave traders were men of the North or free states, generally from the lower order, who, getting a little money by their own hard toil, invested it in slaves purchased in Virginia, Maryland, or Kentucky, and sold them in the cotton, sugar, or rice growing states. and yet the high-bred planter, through mismanagement or other causes, was compelled to sell his slaves, or some of them, at auction, or to let the sole buyer have them. Dr. Gaines's financial affairs being in an unfavorable condition, he yielded to the offers of a noted St. Louis trader by the name of Walker. This man was the terror of the whole Southwest amongst the black population, bond and free, for it was not unfrequently that even free colored persons were kidnapped and carried to the far South and sold. Walker had no conscientious scruples, for money was his god, and he worshipped at no other altar. An uncouth, ill-bred, hard-hearted man with no education, Walker had started at St. Louis as a dray driver and ended as a wealthy slave trader. The day was set for this man to come and purchase his stock, on which occasion Mrs. Gaines absented herself from the place, and even the doctor, although alone, felt deeply the humiliation. For myself, I sat and bit my lips with anger as the vulgar trader said to the faithful man, "Well, my boy, what's your name?" Sam. "Sam, sir, is my name." Walker. "How old are you, Sam?" Sam. "If I live to see next corn planting time, I'll be 27, or 30, or 35. I don't know which, sir." Walker. "Ha, ha, ha. Well, doctor, this is rather a green boy. Well, my fella, are you sound?" Sam. "Yes, sir, I 'spect I is." Walker. "Open your mouth and let me see your teeth. I allers judge a nigger's age by his teeth, same as I does a hoss." "Ah, pretty good set of grinders. Have you got a good appetite?" Sam. "Yes, sir." Walker. "Can you eat your allowance?" Sam. "Yes, sir, when I can get it." Walker. "Get out on the floor and dance. I want to see if you are supple." Sam. "I don't like to dance. I has got religion." Walker. "Oh, ho, you've got religion, have you? That's so much the better. I likes to deal in the gospel. I think he'll suit me. Now, my gal, what's your name?" Sally. "I's Big Sally, sir." Walker. "How old are you, Sally?" Sally. "I don't know, sir, but I heard once that I was born at sweet potato digging time." Walker. "Ha, ha, ha. Don't you know how old you are? Don't you know who made you?" Sally. "I have heard who it was in the Bible that made me, but I done forget the gentleman's name." Walker. "Ha, ha, ha. Well, doctor, this is the greenest lot of niggers I've seen for some time." The last remark struck the doctor deeply, for he had just taken Sally for debt, and therefore he was not responsible for her ignorance, and he frankly told him so. "This is an unpleasant business for me, Mr. Walker," said the doctor, "but you may have Sam for $1,000 and Sally for $900. They are worth all I ask for them. I never banter, Mr. Walker. There they are. You can take them at that price, or let them alone, just as you please." Walker. "Well, doctor, I reckon I'll take 'em, but it's all they are worth. I'll put the handcuffs on 'em, and then I'll pay you. I likes to go according to Scripter. Scripter says if eating meat will offend your brother, you must quit it. And I say if leaving your slaves without the handcuffs will make 'em run away, you must put the handcuffs on 'em. Now, Sam, don't you and Sally cry. I am a tender heart, and it allus makes me feel bad to see people crying. Don't cry, and the first place I get to, I'll buy each of you a great big ginger cake, that I will." And with the last remark, the trader took from a small satchel 2 pairs of handcuffs, putting them on, and with a laugh said, "Now, you look better with the ornaments on." Just then the doctor remarked, There comes Mr. Pension. Walker, looking out and seeing the man of God, said, "It is Mr. Pension, as I live, just the very man I wants to see." And as the reverend gentleman entered, the trader grasped his hand, saying, "Why, how do you do, Mr. Pension? What in the name of Jehu brings you down here to Muddy Creek? Any camp meetings, revival meetings, deathbed scenes, or anything else in your line going on down here? How is religion prospering now, Mr. Pension? I always like to hear about religion." Mr. Pension: "Well, Mr. Walker, the Lord's work is in good condition everywhere now. I tell you, Mr. Walker, I've been in the gospel ministry these 13 years, and I am satisfied that the heart of man is full of sin and desperately wicked. This is a wicked world, Mr. Walker, a wicked world, and we ought all of us to have religion. Religion is a good thing to live by, and we all want it when we die. Yes, sir, when the great trumpet blows, we ought to be ready. And a man in your business of buying and selling slaves needs religion more than anybody else, for it makes you treat your people as you should. Now, there is Mr. Haskins. He is a slave trader, like yourself. Well, I converted him. Before he got religion, he was one of the worst men to his niggers I ever saw. His heart was as hard as stone, but religion has made his heart as soft as a piece of cotton. Before I converted him, he would sell husbands from their wives and seem to take delight in it. But now he won't sell a man from his wife if he can get anyone to buy both of them together. I tell you, sir, religion has done a wonderful work for him." Walker: "I know, Mr. Pension, that I ought to have religion, and I feel that I am a great sinner. And whenever I get with good pious people like you and the doctor, it always makes me feel that I am a desperate sinner. I feel it the more because I've got a religious turn of mind. I know that I would be happier with religion, and the first spare time I get, I am going to try to get it. I'll go to a protracted meeting, and I won't stop till I get religion." The departure of the trader with his property left a sadness even amongst the white members of the family, and special sympathy was felt for Hannah for the loss of her husband by the sale. However, Mrs. Gaines took it coolly, for as Sam was a field hand, she had often said she wanted her to have one of the house servants, and as Cato was without a wife, this seemed to favor her plans. Therefore, a week later, as Hannah entered the sitting room one evening, she said to her, "You need not tell me, Hannah, that you don't want another husband. I know better. Your master has sold Sam, and he's gone down the river, and you'll never see him again. So go and put on your calico dress and meet me in the kitchen. I intend for you to jump the broomstick with Cato. You need not tell me you don't want another man. I know there's no woman living that can be happy and satisfied without a husband." Hannah said, "Oh, missus, I don't want to jump the broomstick with Cato. I don't love Cato. I can't love him." Mrs. Gaines: "Shut up this moment. What do you know about love? I didn't love your master when I married him, and people don't marry for love now. So go and put on your calico dress and meet me in the kitchen." As the servant left for the kitchen, the mistress remarked, "I am glad that the doctor has sold Sam, for now I'll have her marry Cato, and I'll have them both in the house under my eyes." As Hannah entered the kitchen, she said, "Oh, Cato, do go and tell missus that you don't want to jump the broomstick with me. That's a good man. Do, Cato, 'cause I never can love you. It was only last week that Massa sold my Sammy, and I don't want any other man. Do go tell missus that you don't want me." To which Cato replied, "No, Hannah, I ain't a-goin' tell missus no such thing, 'cause I does want you, and I ain't a-goin' tell a lie for you ner nobody else. Dar, now you's got it. I don't see why you need to make so much fuss. I's better looking than Sam, and I's a house servant, and Sam was only a field hand, so you ought to feel proud of a change. So go and do as Mrs. tells you." As the woman retired, the man continued, "Hannah needn't try to get me to tell a lie. I ain't a-goin' to do it, 'cause I does want her, and I's been wantin' her this long time, and soon as Massa sold Sam, I knowed I would get her. By golly, I's goin' to be a married man. Won't I be happy? Now if I could only just run away from old Massa and get to Canada with Hannah, then I'd show him who I was. Ah, that reminds me of my song 'bout old Massa in Canada, and I'll sing it. This is my moriginal hymn. It comed into my head one night when I was fast asleep under an apple tree looking up at the moon." While Hannah was getting ready for the nuptials, Cato amused himself by singing, "The happiest day I ever did see, I'm bound for my heavenly home, when Missus give Hannah to me, through heaven this child will roam." Chorus. "Go away, Sam, you can't come anigh me. Going to meet my friends in heaven, Hannah is going along. Missus says Hannah is mine, so Hannah is going along." Chorus repeated. "Father Gabriel, blow your horn, I'll take wings and fly away. Take Hannah up in the early morn, and I'll be in heaven by the break of day." Chorus. "Go away, Sam, you can't come anigh me. Going to meet my friends in heaven, Hannah is going along. Missus says Hannah is mine, so Hannah is going along." Mrs. Gaines, as she approached the kitchen, heard the servant's musical voice and knew that he was in high glee. Entering, she said, "Ah, Cato, you're ready, are you? Where's Hannah?" Cato. "Yes, missus, I's been waiting this long time. Hannah's been here trying to sway me to tell you that I don't want her, but I telled her that you said I must jump the broomstick with her, and I is going to mind you." Mrs. Gaines. "That's right, Cato. Servants should always mind their masters and mistresses without asking a question." Cato. "Yes, missus, I allers does what you and massa tells me, and axes nobody." While the mistress went in search of Hannah, Dolly came in saying, "Oh, Cato, do go and tell missus that you don't want Hannah. Don't you hear how she's whipping her in the cellar? Do go and tell missus that you don't want Hannah, and then she'll stop whipping her." Cato. "No, Dolly, I ain't a-going to do no such a thing, 'cause if I tell missus that I don't want Hannah, then missus will whip me. And I ain't a-going to be whipped for you, nor Hannah, nor nobody else. Nuh-uh. I'll jump the broomstick with every woman on the place if missus wants me to, before I'll be whipped." Dolly. "Cato, if I was in Hannah's place, I'd see you in the bottomless pit before I'd live with you, you great big wall-eyed, empty-headed, knock-kneed fool. You're as mean as your devilish old missus." Cato. "If you don't quit that busting me, Dolly, I'll tell missus as soon as she comes in, and she'll whip you. You know she will." As Mrs. Gaines entered, she said, "You ought to be ashamed of yourself, Hannah, to make me fatigue myself in this way, to make you do your duty. It's very naughty in you, Hannah. Now, Dolly, you and Susan get the broom, and get out in the middle of the room. There, hold it a little lower, a little higher. There, that'll do. Now remember that this is a solemn occasion. You are going to jump into matrimony. Now, Cato, take hold of Hannah's hand. There. Now, why couldn't you let Cato take hold of your hand before? Now get ready, and when I count 3, do your jump. Eyes on the broomstick. All ready? 1, 2, 3, and over you go. There now, you're husband and wife, and if you don't live happy together, it's your own fault, for I am sure there's nothing to hinder it. Now, Hannah, come up to the house, and I'll give you some whiskey, and you can make some apple toddy, and you and Cato can have a fine time. Now, I'll go back to the parlor. Dolly. I tell you what, Susan, when I get married, I's going to have a preacher to marry me. I ain't going to jump the broomstick. That will do for field hands, but house servants ought to be above that. Susan. Well, child, you can't expect anything else from old missus. She come from down in Carolina, from among the poor white trash. She don't know any better. You can't expect nothing more than a jump from a frog. Missus says she's one of the aristocracy, but she ain't no more of an aristocracy than I is. Missus says she was born with a silver spoon in her mouth. If she was, I wish it had a choked her. That what I wish. The mode of jumping the broomstick was the general custom in the rural districts of the South 40 years ago. And as there was no law whatever in regard to the marriage of slaves, this custom had a binding force with the Negroes as if they had been joined by a clergyman, the difference being the one was not so high-toned as the other. Yet it must be admitted that the blacks always preferred being married by a clergyman. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5. Dr. Gaines and wife, having spent the heated season at the North, traveling for pleasure and seeking information upon the mode of agriculture practiced in the Free States, returned home filled with new ideas which they were anxious to put into immediate execution, and therefore a radical change was at once commenced. Two of the most interesting changes proposed were the introduction of a plow, which was to take the place of the heavy, unwieldy one then in use, and a washing machine, instead of the hard hand-rubbing then practiced. The first called forth much criticism amongst the men in the field, where it was christened the Yankee Dodger, and during the first half a day of its use, it was followed by a large number of the negroes, men and women, wondering at its superiority over the old plow, and wanting to know where it was from. But the excitement in the kitchen amongst the women over the washing machine threw the novelty of the plow entirely in the shade. "And so that tub, with its wheels and fixin', is to do the washin' while we's to sit down and look at it," said Dolly, as 10 or a dozen servants stood around the newcomer, laughing and making fun at its ungainly appearance. "I don't see why Massa didn't buy a woman, out there where the thing is made, and fetch 'em along so she could learn us how to wash with it," remarked Hannah, as her mistress came into the kitchen to give orders about the mode of using the washer. "Now, Dolly," said the mistress, "we are to have new rules hereafter about the work. While at the North, I found that the women got up at 4 o'clock on Monday mornings and commenced the washing, which was all finished and out on the lines by 9 o'clock. Now, remember that hereafter there is to be no more washing on Fridays and ironing on Saturdays as you used to do, and instead of 6 of you great big women to do the washing, 2 of you with the washer can do the work." And out she went, leaving the negroes to the contemplation of the future. "I wish Missus had stayed at home, 'stead of going round the world bringing home new rules. Who she think's going to get out of bed at 4 o'clock in the morning 'cause she fetch home this wash box?" said Dolly as she gave a knowing look at the other servants. "The Lord knows that this child ain't going to get out of her sweet bed at 4 o'clock in the morning, for nobody. You hears that, don't you?" remarked Winnie as she gave a loud laugh and danced out of the room. Before the end of the week Peter had run the new plow against a stump, and had broken it beyond the possibility of repair. When the lady arose on Monday morning at 9:30, her usual time, instead of finding the washing out on the lines, she saw, to her great disappointment, the inside works of the washer taken out, and Dolly, the chief laundress, washing away with all her power in the old way, rubbing with her hands, the perspiration pouring down her black face. "What have you been doing, Dolly, with the washer?" exclaimed the mistress, as she threw up her hands in astonishment. "Well, you see, missus," said the servant, "that machine don't work no way.
I tried it one way, then I tried it the other way, and it still would not work. So you see, I got the screwdriver and I took it to pieces. That's the reason I ain't got along faster with the work."
Mrs. Gaines returned to the parlor, sat down, and had a good cry, declaring her belief that Negroes could not be made white folks, no matter what you should do with them. Although the patent plow and the washer had failed, Dr. and Mrs. Gaines had the satisfaction of knowing that one of their new ideas was to be put into successful execution in a few days. While at the North, they had eaten at a farmhouse some new cheese, just from the press, and on speaking of it, she was told by old Aunt Nancy, the black mamma of the place, that she understood all about making cheese. This piece of information gave general satisfaction, and a cheese press was at once ordered from St. Louis. The arrival of the cheese press, the following week, was the signal for the new sensation. Nancy was at once summoned to the great house for the purpose of superintending the making of the cheese. A prouder person than the old negress could scarcely have been found. Her early days had been spent on the eastern shores of Maryland, where the blacks have an idea that they are, by nature, superior to their race in any other part of the habitable globe. Nancy had always spoken of the Kentucky and Missouri Negroes as low brack trash, and now that all were to be passed over, and the only Marylander on the place called in upon this great occasion, her cup of happiness was filled to the brim. "What do you need besides the cheese press to make the cheese with, Nancy?" inquired Mrs. Gaines, as the old servant stood before her, with her hands resting upon her hips, and looking at the half-dozen slaves who loitered around, listening to what was being said. "Well, missus," replied Nancy, "I must have a runnet." "What's a runnet?" inquired Mrs. Gaines. "Why, you see, missus, you's got to have a sheep killed, and get out of it the maw, and that's what's called the runnet. And I puts that in the milk, and it curdles the milk so it makes cheese." "Then I'll have a sheep killed at once," said the mistress, and orders were given to Jim to kill the sheep. Soon after, the sheep's carcass was distributed amongst the negroes, and the runnet in the hands of old Nancy. That night there was fun and plenty of cheap talk in the negro quarters and in the kitchen, for it had been discovered amongst them that a calf's runnet, and not a sheep's, was the article used to curdle the milk for making cheese. The laugh was then turned upon Nancy, who, after listening to all sorts of remarks in regard to her knowledge of cheese making, said in a triumphant tone, suiting the action to the words, "You niggers think you knows a heap, but you don't know as much as you think. When the sheep is killed, I knows that you niggers will get the meat to eat. I knows that." With this remark, Nancy silenced the entire group. Then, putting her hand akimbo, the old woman sarcastically exclaimed, "Tomorrow you'll all have calf's meat for dinner. Den what will you have to say about old Nancy?" Hearing no reply, she said, "Why is you smart niggers now? Where is you, I ax you?" "Well, then, if Aunt Nancy ain't some punkins, this child knows nuffin," remarked Ike, as he stood up at full length, viewing the situation on as if he had caught a new idea. "I allers told you that Aunt Nancy had mo' in her head than what you ketch out with a fine-tooth comb," exclaimed Peter. "But how is you going to tell Missis 'bout killin' the sheep?" asked Jim. Nancy turned to the headman and replied, "The same mudder which that told me to get some sheep for you niggers would tell me what to do. The Lord always guides me through my troubles and trials. Before I open my mouth, he always fills it." The following day Nancy presented herself at the great house door, and sent in for her mistress. On the lady's appearing, the servant, putting on a knowing look, said, "Missus, when the moon is cold and the water runs high in it, then I have to put calf's runnet in the milk, instead of sheep's. So last night
I see that the moon is cold and the water is running high." "Well, Nancy," said the mistress, "I'll have a calf killed at once, for I can't wait for a warm moon. Go and tell Jim to kill a calf immediately, for I must not be kept out of cheese much longer." On Nancy's return to the quarters, old Ned, who was past work, and who never did anything but eat, sleep, and talk, heard the woman's explanation, and, clapping his wrinkled hands, exclaimed, "Well, den, Nancy, you is wuth more den all de niggers on dis place, for you gives us fresh meat ebery day." After getting the right runnet and 2 weeks' work on the new cheese, a little soft, sour, hard-looking thing, appearing like anything but a cheese, was exhibited at Poplar Farm, to the great amusement of the blacks and the disappointment of the whites, and especially Mrs. Gaines, who had frequently remarked that her mouth was watering for the new cheese. No attempt was ever made afterwards to renew the cheese making, and the press was laid under the shed by the side of the washing machine and the patent plow. While we had 3 or 4 trustworthy and faithful servants, it must be admitted that most of the negroes on Poplar Farm were always glad to shirk labor, and thought that to deceive the whites was a religious duty. Wit and religion has ever been the negro's forte while in slavery. Wit, with which to please his master or to soften his anger when displeased, and religion to enable him to endure punishment when inflicted. Both Dr. and Mrs. Gaines were easily deceived by their servants. Indeed, I often thought that Mrs. Gaines took peculiar pleasure in being misled by them, and even the doctor, with his long experience and shrewdness, would allow himself to be carried off upon almost any pretext. For instance, when he retired at night, Ike, Big Body's servant, would take his master's clothes out of the room, brush them off, and return them in time for the doctor to dress for breakfast. There was nothing in this out of the way, but the master would often remark that he thought Ike brushed his clothes too much, for they appeared to wear out a great deal faster than they had formerly. Ike, however, attributed the wear to the fact that the goods were wanting in soundness. Thus the master, at the advice of his servant, changed his tailor. About the same time the doctor's watch stopped at night, and when taken to be repaired, the watchmaker found it badly damaged, which he pronounced had been done by a fall. As the doctor was always very careful with his timepiece, he could in no way account for the stoppage. Ike was questioned as to his handling of it, but he could throw no light upon the subject. At last, one night about 12 o'clock, a message came for the doctor to visit a patient who had a sudden attack of cholera morbus. The faithful Ike was nowhere to be found, nor could any traces of the doctor's clothes be discovered. Not even the watch, which was always laid upon the mantel shelf, could be seen anywhere. It seemed clear that Ike had run away with his master's daily wearing apparel, watch and all. Yes, and further search showed that the boots, with one heel 4 inches higher than the other, had also disappeared. But go the doctor must, and Mrs. Gaines and all of us went to work to get the doctor ready. While Cato was hunting up the old boots and Hannah was in the attic getting the old hat, Jim returned from the barn and informed his master that the sorrel horse, which he had ordered to be saddled, was nowhere to be found, and that he had got out the bay mare, and as there was no saddle on the place, Ike having taken the only one, he, Jim, had put the buffalo robe on the mare. It was a bright moonlight night, and to see the doctor on horseback without a saddle, dressed in his castaway suit, was indeed ridiculous in the extreme. However, he made the visit, saved the patient's life, came home, and went snugly to bed. The following morning, to the doctor's great surprise, in walked Ike at his usual time, with the clothes in one hand and the boots nicely blacked in the other. The faithful slave had not seen any of the other servants, and consequently did not know of the master's discomfiture on the previous night. "Were any of the servants off the place last night?" inquired the doctor, as Ike laid the clothes carefully on a chair and was setting down the boots. "No, I 'spect not," answered Ike. "Were you off anywhere last night?" asked the master. "No, sir," replied the servant. "What? Not off the place at all?" inquired the doctor sharply. Ike looked confused, and evidently began to smell of mice. "Well, massa, I was not away, only to step over to the prayer meeting at the Corners a little while, that's all," said Ike. "Where's my watch?" asked the doctor. "I 'spect it's on the mantel shelf dar, where I put it last night, sir," replied Ike, and at the same time reached to the timepiece, where he had laid it a moment before, and, holding it up triumphantly, "Here it is, sir, right where I left it last night." Ike was told to go, which he was glad to do. "What shall I do with that fellow?" said the doctor to his wife, as the servant quitted the room. Ike had scarcely reached the back yard when he met Cato, who told him of his absence on the previous night being known to his master. When Ike had heard all, he exclaimed, "Well, den, if the old boss knows it, dis nigger is cotch sure as you was born." "I would not be in your shoes, Ike, for a heap this morning," said Cato. "Well," replied Ike, "I thank the Lord that I has got religion to stand it." Dr. Gaines, as he dressed himself, found nothing out of the way until he came to look at the boots. The doctor was lame from birth. Here he saw unmistakable evidence that the high heel had been taken off and had been replaced by a screw put through the inside, and the seam waxed over. Dr. Gaines had often thought, when putting his boots on in the morning, that they appeared a little loose, and on speaking of it to his servant, the negro would attribute it to the blacking, which he said made the leather stretch. That morning when breakfast was over and the negroes called in for family prayers, all eyes were upon Ike. It has always appeared strange that the negroes should seemingly take such delight in seeing their fellow servants in a bad fix. But it is nevertheless true, and Ike's bad luck appeared to furnish sport for old and young of his own race. At the conclusion of prayers, the doctor said, "Now, Ike, I want you to tell me the truth, and nothing but the truth, of your whereabouts last night, and why you wore away my clothes." "Well, massa," said Ike, "I'm going to tell you God's truth." "That's what I want, Ike," remarked the master. "Now," continued the negro, "I wear the clothes to the dance, 'cause you see, massa, I know that you didn't want your body servant to go to the ball looking poor dressed than other gentlemen's boys. So you see I had no clothes myself, so I takes yours. I had to knock the heel off the lame leg boot so that I could wear it. And then I took old Sorrel, 'cause he paces so fast and so easy. No other hoss could get me to the city in time for the ball 'ceptin' old Sorrel. You see, massa, 10 miles is a good ways to go after you is gone to bed. Now, massa, I hope you'll forgive me this time, and I'll never do so any more." During Ike's telling his story, his master kept his eyes riveted upon him, and at its conclusion said, "You first told me that you were at the prayer meeting at the Corners. What did you do that for?" "Well, massa," replied Ike, "I knowed dat I oughter had gone to the prayer meeting, and that's the reason I said I was dar." "And you're a pretty Christian, going to a dance instead of your prayer meeting. This is the 5th time you've fallen from grace," said the master. "Oh, no," quickly responded Ike. "This is only the 4th time that I has backslid." "But this is not the first time that you have taken my clothes and worn them. And there's my watch. You could not tell the time. What did you want with that?" said the doctor. "Yes, massa," replied Ike. I'll tell the truth. I wore the clothes afore this time, and I take the watch too, and I let it fall, and that's the reason it stopped that time. And I know I could not tell due time by the watch, but I guessed at it, and that made the nigger stare at me to see me have a watch." The announcement that Colonel Lemmy was at the door cut short the further investigation of Ike's case. The colonel was the very opposite to Dr. Gaines, believing that there was no good in the Negro except to toil, and feeling that all religious efforts to better the condition of the race was time thrown away. The colonel laughed heartily as the doctor told how Ike had worn his clothes. He quickly inquired if the servant had been punished, and when informed that he had not, he said, "The lash is worth more than all the religion in the world. Your boy Ike, with the rest of the niggers around here, will go to a prayer meeting and will tell how good they feel or how bad they feel, just as it may suit the case. They'll cry, groan, clap their hands, pat their feet, worry themselves into a lather of sweat, sing, 'I'm a-gonna keep a-climbing high, see the heavenly land, till I meet them 'ere angels in the sky, see the heavenly land, dem pooty angels I shall see the heavenly land, why don't the devil let a me be, see the heavenly land.' Yes, doctor, these niggers will pray till 12 o'clock at night, break up their meeting and go home shouting and singing 'Glory, Hallelujah,' and every darn one of them will steal a chicken, turkey, or pig, and cry out, 'Come down, sweet chariot, and carry me home to heaven.' Yes, and still continue to sing till they go to sleep. You may give your slaves religion, and I'll give mine the whip, and I'll bet that I'll get the most tobacco and hemp out of the same number of hands." "I hardly think," said the doctor, after listening attentively to his neighbor, "that I can let Ike pass without some punishment. Yet I differ with you in regard to the good effects of religion upon all classes, more especially our Negroes, for the African is preeminently a religious being. With them, I admit, there is considerable superstition. They have a permanent belief in good and bad luck, ghosts, fortune-telling, and the like. But we whites are not entirely free from such notions." At the last sentence or two the colonel's eyes sparkled, and he began to turn pale, for it was well known that he was a firm believer in ghosts and fortune-telling. "Now, doctor," said Colonel Lemmy, "every sensible man must admit the fact that ghosts exist, and that there is nothing in the world truer than that the future can be told. Look at Mrs. McWilliams' lawsuit with Major Todd. She went to old Frank, the nigger fortune-teller, and asked him which lawyer she should employ. The old man gazed at her for a moment or two and said, 'Missus, you's got your mind on 2 lawyers, a big man and a little man. If you takes the big man, you loses the case. If you takes the little man, you wins the case.' Sure enough, she had in contemplation the employment of either Maguire or Darby. The first is a large man, the latter was, as you know, a small man. So, taking the old negro's advice, she obtained the services of John F. Darby and gained the suit." "Yes," responded the doctor, "I have always heard that the widow McWilliams gained her case by consulting old Frank." "Why, doctor," continued the colonel, in an animated manner, "when the races were at St. Louis 3 years ago, I went to old Betty, the blind fortune-teller, to see which horse was going to win, and she said, 'Massa, bet your money on the gray mare.' Well, you see, everybody thought that Johnson's black horse would win, and piles of money was bet on him. However, I bet $100 on the gray mare, and to the utter surprise of all, she won. When the race was over, I was asked how I come to bet on the mare when everybody was putting their funds on the horse. I then told them that I never risked my money on any horse till I found out which was going to win. Now, with regard to ghosts, just let me say to you, doctor, that I saw the ghost of the peddler that was murdered over on the old road just as sure as you were born." "Do you think so?" asked the doctor. "Think so? Why, I know it, just as well as I know that I see you now. He had his pack on his back, and it was in the daytime, no night work about it. He looked at me, and I watched him till he got out of sight. But wasn't I frightened? It made the hair stand up on my head, I tell you. Did he speak to you? Asked the doctor. Oh, no, he didn't speak, but he had a sorrowful look, and as he was getting out of sight, he turned and looked over his shoulder at me. Most of the superstition among the whites in our section was the result of their close connection with the blacks. For the servants told the most foolish stories to the children in the nurseries, and they learned more, as they grew older, from the slaves in the quarters or out on the premises. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6. Profitable and interesting amusements were always needed at the Corners, the nearest place to the poplar farm. At the tavern, post office, and the store, all the neighborhood assembled to read the news, compare notes, and to talk politics. Shows seldom ventured to stop there, for want of sufficient patronage. Once in 3 months, however, they had a gander snatching, which never failed to draw together large numbers of ladies as well as gentlemen, the elite as well as the common. The getter-up of this entertainment would procure a gander of the wild goose species. This bird had a long neck, which was large as it rose above the breast, but tapered gradually for more than half the length until it became small and serpent-like in form, terminating in a long, slim head and peaked bill. The head and neck of the gander was well greased, the legs were tied together with a strong cord, and the bird was then fastened by its legs to a swinging limb of a tree. The snatchers were to be on horseback, and were to start 15 or 20 rods from the gander, riding at full speed, and, as they passed along under the bird, they had the right to pull his head off if they could. To accelerate the speed of the horses, a man was stationed a few feet from the gander with orders to give every horse a cut with his whip as he went by. Sometimes the bird's head would be caught by 10 or a dozen before they would succeed in pulling it off, which was necessary. Often by the sudden jump of the animal, or the rider having taken a little too much wine, he would fall from his horse, which event would give additional interest to the snatching. The poor gander would frequently show far more sagacity than its torturers. After having its head caught once or twice, the gander would draw up its head or dodge out of the way. Sometimes the snatcher would have in his hand a bit of sandpaper, which would enable him to make a tighter grasp, but this mode was generally considered unfair, and on one occasion caused a duel in which both parties were severely wounded. But the most costly and injurious amusement that the people in our section entered into was that of card playing, a species of gambling too much indulged in throughout the entire South. This amusement causes much sadness, for it often occurs that gentlemen lose large sums at the gambling table, frequently seriously embarrassing themselves, sometimes bringing ruin upon whole families. Mr. Oscar Smith, residing near Poplar Farm, took a trip to St. Louis, thence to New Orleans and back. On the steamer he was beguiled into gaming. "Go call my boy, steward," said Mr. Smith as he took his cards one by one from the table. In a few moments a fine-looking, bright-eyed mulatto boy, apparently about 15 years of age, was standing by his master's side at the table. "I will see you, and $500 better," said Smith, as his servant Jerry approached the table. "What price do you set on that boy?" asked Johnson, as he took a roll of bills from his pocket. "He will bring $1,000 any day in the New Orleans market," replied Smith. "Then you bet the whole of the boy, do you?" "Yes." "I call you, then," said Johnson, at the same time spreading his cards out upon the table. "You have beat me," said Smith, as soon as he saw the cards.
Jerry, who was standing on top of the table with the bank notes and silver dollars round his feet, was now ordered to descend from the table. "You will not forget that you belong to me," said Johnson, as the young slave was stepping from the table to a chair. "Na, sir," replied the chattel. "Now go back to your bed, and be up in time tomorrow morning to brush my clothes and clean my boots. Do you hear?" "Yes, sir," responded Jerry, as he wiped the tears from his eyes. As Mr. Smith left the gambling table, he said, "I claim the right of redeeming that boy, Mr. Johnson. My father gave him to me when I came of age, and I promise not to part with him." "Most certainly, sir, the boy shall be yours whenever you hand me over a cool 1,000," replied Johnson. The next morning, as the passengers were assembling in the breakfast saloons and upon the guards of the vessel, and the servants were seen running about waiting upon or looking for their masters, poor Jerry was entering his new master's state-room with his boots. The genuine wit of the Negro is often a marvel to the whites, and this wit, or humor, as it may be called, is brought out in various ways. Not unfrequently is it exhibited by the black, when he really means to be very solemn. Thus our Sampy met Davidson's Joe on the road to the Corners, and called out to him several times without getting an answer. At last, Joe, appearing much annoyed, stopped, looked at Sampy in an attitude of surprise, and exclaimed, "Ain't you got no manners? Where's your eyes? Don't you see I is a funeral?" It was not till then that Sampy saw that Joe had a box in his arms, resembling a coffin, in which was a deceased Negro child. The Negro would often show his wit to the disadvantage of his master or mistress. When visitors were at Poplar Farm, Dr. Gaines would frequently call in Cato to sing a song or crack a joke, for the amusement of the company. On one occasion, requesting the servant to give a toast, at the same time handing the Negro a glass of wine, the latter took the glass, held it up, looked at it, began to show his ivory, and said, "The big bee flies high, the little bee makes the honey, the black man raise the cotton, and the white man gets the money." The same servant, going to meeting one Sabbath, was met on the road by Major Ben O'Fallon, who was riding on horseback with a hoisted umbrella to keep the rain off. The Major, seeing the Negro trudging along bareheaded and with something under his coat, supposing he had stolen some article which he was attempting to hide, said, "What's that you've got under your coat, boy?" "Nothing, sir, but my hat," replied the slave, and at the same time drawing forth a second-hand beaver. "Is it yours?" inquired the Major. "Yes, sir," was the quick response of the Negro. "Well," continued the Major, "if it is yours, why don't you wear it and save your head from the rain?" "Oh," replied the servant, with a smile of seeming satisfaction, "de head belongs to massa, and de hat belongs to me. Let massa take care of his property, and I'll take care of mine." Dr. Gaines, while taking a neighbor out to the pigsty to show him some choice hogs that he intended for the next winter's bacon, said to Dolly, who was feeding the pigs, "How much lard do you think you can get out of that big hog, Dolly?" The old negress scratched her woolly head, put on thoughtful look, and replied, "I specs I can get a pail full, if the pail ain't too big." "I reckon you can," responded the master. The ladies are not without their recreation, the most common of which is snuff dipping. A snuff box or bottle is carried, and with it a very small stick or cane, which has been chewed at the end until it forms a small mop. The little dippers or sticks are sold in bundles for the use of the ladies, and can be bought simply cut in the requisite lengths or chewed ready for use. This the dipper moistens with saliva, and dips into the snuff box, and then lifts the mop thus loaded inside the lips. In some parts they courteously hand round the snuff and dipper, or place a plentiful supply of snuff on the table, into which all the company may dip. Amongst even the better classes of whites, the ladies would often assemble in considerable numbers, especially during revival meeting times, place a wash dish in the middle of the room, all gather around it, commence snuff dipping, and all using the wash dish as a common spittoon. Every well-bred lady carries her own snuff box and dipper. Generally during church service, where the clergyman is a little prosy, snuff dipping is indispensable. End of chapter 6.